Imagine receiving $10,000 unexpectedly, not as a reward tied to effort, but as a sudden shift in your financial position, a moment that feels significant at first, almost like a reset point, and yet if you observe what happens over the following weeks or months, the impact often fades far more quickly than expected, not because the amount was insignificant, but because of how financial systems interact with behavior, perception, and structure. The experience creates a brief sense of expansion, where decisions feel less constrained, where small purchases seem justified, where pressure temporarily decreases, and yet beneath that surface, the underlying system remains unchanged. What makes this dynamic particularly interesting is not the spending itself, but the way the mind reinterprets scale. When an individual operates within a limited financial margin, every dollar carries weight, every decision is filtered through necessity, and constraints shape behavior in a very direct way. But when that margin expands suddenly, even temporarily, the reference point shifts, and what once felt like a meaningful expense begins to feel negligible in comparison. This is not irrational, it is contextual, because the brain evaluates value relative to available resources rather than in absolute terms. Over time, this shift creates a pattern where the temporary increase in capacity leads to decisions that align with the new perceived baseline, not the previous one. Spending adjusts upward, not dramatically at first, but gradually, in ways that feel reasonable in isolation. A slightly higher standard of convenience, a slightly better version of a product, a few more instances of discretionary spending, each one individually small, but collectively redefining the structure of expenses. The result is not an obvious depletion, but a quiet normalization of higher outflow. From a mathematical perspective, the effect is subtle but consistent. If expenses rise to match available resources, then the net difference between income and spending remains narrow, which means the capacity to convert the temporary increase into long-term assets becomes limited. The system absorbs the input and returns to equilibrium, not by design, but through behavior. In this sense, the $10,000 does not disappear randomly. It is redistributed across a slightly expanded lifestyle that now feels normal. There is also a timing component that is often overlooked. When money arrives without a predefined allocation, it tends to be integrated into existing patterns rather than redirected into new structures. Without intentional separation, it blends into daily flow, where it becomes subject to the same forces that govern regular income. This is why the impact feels temporary, because the system treats it as part of the present rather than as a tool for altering the future. Psychologically, this creates a disconnect between expectation and outcome. The expectation is that a larger amount of money should create a lasting change, while the outcome reflects the persistence of existing patterns. This gap can lead to confusion, not because the math is complex, but because the mechanisms are subtle. The system does not resist change directly, it simply redirects it through familiar pathways. When you step back and observe this from a broader perspective, it becomes clear that the issue is not the amount itself, but the structure into which it enters. Financial systems are shaped by recurring behaviors, by default allocations, by the absence or presence of buffers, and by the way decisions are made under different conditions. A one-time increase, no matter the size, interacts with these structures rather than replacing them. This leads to a more grounded way of thinking about money, where the focus shifts from the size of individual events to the patterns that persist over time. Instead of asking what $10,000 can do in isolation, the more relevant question becomes how financial inputs are processed within a system, how they are allocated, and whether they are allowed to change the trajectory or simply reinforce the existing path. The reality is that financial change rarely comes from single moments, even large ones, but from gradual adjustments in how resources are managed, how decisions are framed, and how margin is preserved. When those elements shift, even small amounts can begin to behave differently, not because they are larger, but because the system they enter has changed. And once you begin to see money this way, not as isolated amounts but as inputs moving through a structure, the experience of it disappearing becomes less mysterious and more predictable, revealing that the true leverage point is not the number itself, but the system that determines where it flows and how long it stays.